It started with a knock. Marie and David had planned their winter getaway for months, envisioning it as the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. Nestled deep in the woods, the cabin was everything they hoped for: rustic charm, a roaring fireplace, and a blanket of fresh snow. The nearest neighbor was miles away, leaving them entirely alone. Or so they thought. The first knock came on their second night. It was soft, almost hesitant against the back wall of the cabin. Marie glanced up from her book, her brow furrowing. "Did you hear that?" she asked. David, engrossed in his laptop, shook his head. "Hear what?" Another knock followed, this time sharper, like a quick rap of knuckles. They both froze, staring at each other. The sound came from outside, near the kitchen window. David grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, stepping out into the freezing air. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but snow-covered ground and skeletal trees. No footprints, no signs of anyone. "Probably just a branch," he said, brushing it off, though his voice held a note of uncertainty. Marie wasn't convinced. The knocks became a nightly occurrence. Each time they came from a different part of the cabin, first the back wall, then the front porch, then from somewhere near the roof. David insisted it was just the old cabin settling or the wind playing tricks. But Marie started noticing other things. One morning she woke up to find footprints in the snow leading directly to their front door. They were large, too large for any animal, and they ended abruptly at the steps, as though the visitor had simply vanished. Then there were the messages. At first they were subtle, a handprint on the frosted window, smudged as if someone had pressed their palm against the glass. But then words began to appear. The first was a single word, scrawled in the frost: "Hello." Marie's stomach dropped when she saw it. "David," she whispered, pulling him to the window. "Look." He stared at the letters, his face pale. "It's just condensation," he muttered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Maybe we should leave." But leaving wasn't an option. By the third day, a heavy snowstorm rolled in, burying their car under a thick layer of snow and cutting off any chance of escape. The cabin became a prison, and the presence outside grew bolder. The knocks turned to bangs, heavy and deliberate, as though someone or something was testing the walls. At night they heard whispers, faint but unmistakable, seeping through the wooden slats. "Marie," David said one night, his voice low, I think it's inside." She stared at him, horrified. "What do you mean?" "I locked the door before we went to bed," he said. "But it was open this morning, wide open, and..." He hesitated, swallowing hard. There were wet footprints on the floor, leading to the bedroom. Marie's blood turned to ice. Desperation set in. They began barricading the doors and windows with furniture, staying awake in shifts to keep watch. But no matter how vigilant they were, the presence found ways to torment them. The messages in the frost became more sinister. "Get out! Leave now!" And then, on the fifth night, Marie woke to find the word "run" scrawled across the bathroom mirror in red. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, trembling, but the fear in David's eyes told her he was just as terrified. That night they heard a voice for the first time. It was faint, almost childlike, coming from outside the front door. "Let me in," it pleaded. "Please, I'm so cold." David clutched the axe they had found in the shed, his knuckles white. "Don't open it," Marie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I won't," he promised, though his voice wavered. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in, let me in." Then silence. When morning came, they found the cabin in disarray. The furniture was overturned, the windows shattered, and strange symbols were carved into the walls. David decided it was time to risk the storm. "We can't stay here," he said, grabbing their bags. As they trudged through the snow, the forest felt unnaturally quiet, the trees looming like silent sentinels. They didn't look back. too afraid of what they might see. When they reached the car, Marie froze. "David," she whispered, pointing to the windshield. Written in the frost, in the same scrawled letters, was a final message. "See you soon." The blizzard hit harder than any of them expected. Emma, Jake, Caroline and Tyler had rented the ski lodge to celebrate the holidays. It was meant to be a weekend of laughter, hot cocoa by the fire and snowboarding down pristine slopes. The lodge, perched on a remote mountainside, was picture perfect. But by the second night, the storm arrived, and with it, something none of them could explain. It began with the power outage. They were gathered in the living room, playing cards, when the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Tyler found the generator in the basement and managed to get it running, but something about the basement unnerved him. "There's a weird smell down there," he said, brushing the snow off his jacket as he returned. Emma raised an eyebrow. "What kind of smell?" "Like burnt wood, but mixed with something rotten." He shivered. "Probably just old wiring." But Caroline noticed something else. "Guys," she said, peering out the window, "do you see that?" They gathered around her, squinting into the swirling snow. At first it was hard to make out, but then they saw it, a faint glow like a lantern moving slowly through the trees. "Maybe it's another cabin," Jake suggested. "There's no one else out here," Tyler replied, his voice low. Emma frowned. "Then who's holding the light?" The light disappeared into the woods, but the unease lingered. They tried to brush it off, returning to their card game, but the mood had shifted. Every creak of the old lodge, every gust of wind, felt charged with a new tension. When they went to bed that night, the nightmares began. Emma dreamed she was trapped in the snow, unable to move, while shadowy figures loomed over her, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. Tyler woke up in a cold sweat, convinced he'd heard footsteps in his room. By morning, the storm had worsened. The snow was piled so high against the doors and windows that they couldn't leave, even if they wanted to. The generator sputtered and died, leaving them with only a dwindling supply of firewood for warmth. And then Caroline found the carvings. They were etched into the wooden beams above the fireplace, intricate spiraling symbols that hadn't been there before. "Maybe we just didn't notice them," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Or maybe someone else was here before us," Emma countered. "Someone who knew we'd come," Tyler muttered, staring at the symbols with a mix of fascination and dread. That night the knocking began. It came from the roof at first, slow, deliberate thuds that echoed through the lodge. Jake climbed up to check, armed with a flashlight, but the snow was untouched. "It's probably just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. But when the knocking moved to the walls, then to the windows, their fear became palpable. At one point, Caroline screamed, swearing she'd seen a face pressed against the glass, a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes. They searched the perimeter the next morning and found nothing but more snow. The lantern light returned that evening, closer this time. It circled the lodge, pausing at each window before disappearing into the trees. "Whoever it is," Tyler said, gripping a fireplace poker like a weapon, "they're trying to scare us." "It's working," Emma whispered. The final night was the worst. As the storm raged outside, the lodge felt alive with malevolent energy. The carvings on the beams seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The knocking turned into pounding, as though something was trying to break in. Then came the voices. They were faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but soon they grew louder, disembodied whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Get out! Leave now! You don't belong here!" The four of them huddled together in the living room, the fireplace their only source of light and heat. "What do we do?" Caroline asked, her voice trembling. "We wait it out," Jake said, though his face was pale. "The storm has to end eventually." But deep down, they all knew the storm wasn't the only thing keeping them there. When the morning finally came, the storm had passed. The sun shone brightly on the snow-covered landscape, making it seem almost peaceful. But inside the lodge, peace was the last thing they felt. As they prepared to leave, they found one final message. It was scrawled in the snow just outside the front door, written in long, jagged letters. You were warned. They never spoke about what happened in the lodge again. But sometimes, in the dead of winter, Emma swears she hears faint knocking on her bedroom window, a chilling reminder of the storm that nearly buried them all. It was supposed to be his greatest achievement as a solo hiker. Colin had spent years building his skills and preparing for this trek, crossing the remote Wildhorn mountain range in the dead of winter. The snow-covered peaks were breathtaking, and the solitude of the wilderness was exactly what he craved. A seasoned outdoorsman, he felt confident in his ability to handle the challenges ahead. But as the days passed, something about the mountain began to unsettle him. The first sign came on his third day, as he navigated a narrow path along the ridge. Fresh snowfall had blanketed the ground overnight, and Colin marveled at the pristine beauty of the untouched landscape. That's when he noticed the footprints. They were large, human-like, and oddly spaced, as if whoever made them had an irregular gait. What unnerved him was their direction. They led straight toward him. Looking ahead, he saw no one. Looking behind, he saw only his own tracks. Shaking off a creeping sense of unease, Colin pressed on, telling himself it was probably just a trick of the wind and snow. That night, the wind howled around his tent, causing the fabric to shudder violently. He lay awake, listening to the storm, when he heard something else. A faint, crunching sound like footsteps in the snow. Colin froze, every muscle tensing. The sound grew louder, circling his tent. He held his breath, clutching his knife, waiting for whoever, or whatever, it was to make itself known. But after a few agonizing minutes, the crunching stopped, leaving only the wail of the wind. When morning came, Colin unzipped his tent cautiously. The footprints were there again, circling the tent in uneven, lurching steps. He scanned the horizon, his heart pounding. "Who's out here?" he called into the vast emptiness. His voice echoed, but there was no reply. On the fifth day, the trail took him through a dense forest of snow-laden pines. The air felt heavy, as if the trees themselves were watching him. As he trudged through the knee-deep snow, he heard a sound that stopped him in his tracks, a low, guttural humming. It came from somewhere ahead, muffled by the trees. Slowly, cautiously, Colin crept forward, his heart beat thunderous in his ears. He found the source of the sound in a small clearing. A figure stood there, hunched and still, its back to him. It wore tattered, colorless clothing and swayed slightly, as though humming a tune Colin couldn't quite make out. "Hello?" Colin called, his voice cracking. The figure stopped humming. It turned its head slightly, just enough for Colin to see a pale, angular profile and eyes that glinted like ice. Without thinking, Colin took a step back and snapped a branch underfoot. The figure whipped around fully. Its face was wrong, unnatural. The features were sharp, almost skeletal, with skin stretched tightly over bones. And its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Colin didn't wait to see what it would do. He ran, crashing through the trees, not caring about the noise he made. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around him. When he finally broke free into open snow, he didn't stop running until his legs gave out. That night, Colin set up camp in a small, sheltered valley, hoping the terrain would shield him from the wind and whatever was following him. He didn't sleep, his knife clutched tightly in his hand. Just before dawn, he heard it again, the crunch of footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at his tent. Colin peeked through a small opening in the fabric. The figure was standing just a few feet away, staring directly at the tent. Its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, unblinking. Colin's hand trembled as he gripped his knife. "What do you want?" he shouted. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him, and then took a slow, deliberate step closer. Colin bolted from the tent, abandoning everything but his knife and flashlight. The figure didn't run. It stalked him, its lurching gait eerily steady. No matter how fast Colin ran, it was always there, just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. By the time the sun rose, Colin had made it to a frozen river. He followed it downstream, desperate for any sign of civilization. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't dare stop. Finally, he saw it. A small ranger station perched on the edge of the forest. Summoning the last of his strength, Colin stumbled to the door and pounded on it until it opened. A grizzled ranger stared at him in shock. "What happened to you?" Colin tried to explain, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The ranger's face grew grim as he listened. "You're lucky you made it," the ranger said finally. "People talk about something like that out here. A spirit, or maybe something worse. It's said to follow hikers who disturb its territory." Colin stared at him, his blood running cold. "What does it want?" The ranger shrugged. "Nobody knows. Most don't live to tell the tale." Colin glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at him. He never hiked alone again.